Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to the 76th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations Charter. The birthplace of the United Nations is in the San Francisco War Memorial Veterans Building. We recognize that the location is on the unceded ancestral territory of the Ohlone tribe. I am Mary Steiner, President of the United Nations Association San Francisco chapter, known as UNASF, and the moderator for this first session about the past of the UN Charter. The purpose of the San Francisco chapter is to inform, inspire, and mobilize people who live in the United States to support the principles and the vital work of the United Nations, as well as to strengthen the United Nations system. We are providing a platform for partnerships to achieve the UN goals. The UNASF greatly appreciates its members who contribute generously and selflessly to producing these educational programs. I want to especially thank our lead, Dr. Dan Becker, who designed and curated the 3 sessions. UNASF Communications and Program Committee members developed and implemented the design. The specialized members are Jennifer Nilsson, Ismahan Elfree, and James Wanchin Lee. On behalf of the UNASF, we are thrilled that you can join us on this very momentous day and hope that you will consider becoming a UNA member. As we, the peoples, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, we reaffirm that we want human rights, dignity and worth of the human person, equal rights for men and women, nations large and small, to establish conditions and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law. We want social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. All of this is so eloquently and loftily written into the preamble of the UN Charter. So these lofty goals were set out in 1945. We'll be looking at how well we are achieving these goals. It is a great honor today to have 2 of the most distinguished United Nations experts accepting our invitation to look back at this point in time to the mighty united effort to create the United Nations Charter in 1945. Our first presenter is Professor Paul Michael Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is the J. Richardson Dilworth Professor of History at Yale University. He is a former fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies, Princeton University. He was made Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, in 2000. And it was for services to history. And he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in June 2003. Professor Kennedy's monthly column on current global issues is distributed worldwide by the Los Angeles Times Syndicate Tribune Media Services. He is the author or editor of 19 books, including The War Plans of the Great Powers, The Realities Behind Diplomacy, and Preparing for the 21st Century. His best-known work is The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, which provided an intense debate on its publication in 1988. Kennedy helped draft the Ford Foundation-sponsored report issued in 1995, The United Nations in its Second Half Century, which was prepared for the 50th anniversary of the UN, it was included in this work. His 2005 book, The Parliament of Man, contemplates the past and future of the United Nations. Professor Kennedy's most recent book, Engineers of Victory, History Through the Eyes of Problem Solvers During the Second World War, was published in 2013. He is currently writing a book about sea power and global transformations during World War II. Professor Kennedy, What was the general historical background to the founding of the world body at the end of World War II? Professor Kennedy.
The designers of this extraordinary instrument, the Charter of the United Nations, were operating in historical time. It was still the Second World War underway. The first drafts of the document for a new design to replace that of the League of Nations were being done already in 1943. It was now getting close to the end of the war, but the great powers were still fighting. Germany did not surrender until May of 1945. Japan was still fighting. The atomic bomb was not known about. These drafters, this mixture of intellectuals, but especially State Department and Foreign Office officials, were coming together to produce a document, an instrument for the nations of the world as they met to subscribe to it and sign the charter in June 1945, were aware that they were still at war. So although the preamble to the United Nations Charter is this wonderful, high elevating document about its purposes, you move very quickly on to a document which is very cleverly done, very cleverly crafted, and is about the distribution of the necessary roles of this new organization. So the first thing to note is that while the early parts of the United Nations Charter are going to talk about the General Assembly, they move on to the Security Council, they move on to the other parts, which Mr. Schlesinger is going to describe in a bit more detail. This was written by people concerned that a great war was still being fought, and the great powers, the big powers, the ones which were going to be given the veto powers and permanent membership, were taking the lead here. So it was written by officials who were part and parcel of the great power system. It had to try to escape from the disasters which had unfolded in the 1930s as the early hopes of the 1920s and the League of Nations fell away. It was aware that an economic and social catastrophe had crossed the world after the Great Depression. It was aware that rogue states had arisen and in the future somehow needed to be controlled. These people were operating in real time with a sense of real international crisis behind them. They were led by the belief that they could do better next time. When they came to San Francisco, the large powers and the smaller members of the already recognized United Nations, they were to do better, but they were set in historical time. And they knew that what they were trying to create could be just the first initial steps of this great recovery of humankind. I think I will stop there after that scene setting and see if we can now move to a look at the way the Charter tries to capture this broad historical reality and the fears and hopes of those who had drafted it.
Thank you. Yes, we thank you, Professor Kennedy. We are joined by Stephen Schlesinger. Stephen Schlesinger is a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City. He is the former director of the World Policy Institute at the New School, 1997 to 2006, and former publisher of the World Policy, publisher of the quarterly magazine, the World Policy Institute. In the early 1970s, he edited and published the New Democrat magazine. Thereafter, he spent 4 years as a staff writer at Time magazine. In the mid-1990s, he worked at the United Nations at Habitat, the agency dealing with global cities. He is the author of 3 books, including Act of Creation, the Founding of the United Nations, for which he won the 2004 Harry S. Truman Book Award. His book, Bitter Fruit, also the story of the US coup in Guatemala with Stephen Kinzer, was cited as one of the New York Times notable books for 1982 and sold over 100,000 copies. And The Reformers. He is co-editor with Andrew Schlesinger of the best-selling Journals 1952 to 2000, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and of the Letters of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He is a specialist on the United Nations and on the foreign policies of the Clinton, Bush, and Obama, as well as the Trump administrations. He has appeared in 9 documentaries about the UN. We're very, very honored to have you with us today, and we would like you to talk a little more about the details of the UN Conference on International Organization, otherwise known as the San Francisco Conference in 1945.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate Professor Kennedy's setting the stage for the conference that did happen in 1945 in San Francisco. Now, from the American point of view, and this is the crucial point of view in terms of this body coming into being, the key figure here was President Franklin Roosevelt, who had been a big promoter and supporter of the League of Nations when he served under Woodrow Wilson. When Roosevelt came into office, he served 4 terms. By his second term, he was already thinking about reviving the charter, which had been fallen into disuse because the US never joined it. And as a country, as the world got closer to the Second World War, he became single-mindedly focused on establishing a new security body. In fact, his whole final years of his time in office, all his concentration was on this body and creating security for the world. As Professor Kennedy pointed out, the world had gone through 2 world wars. Over 90 million people had died. And he was absolutely set, President Roosevelt, on making sure that did not happen again. But he needed the support of many other countries in order to make this thing happen. First of all, he had to overcome isolationism in his own country. Therefore, he secretly instructed the US State Department to begin working on an outline of a new security body, but without telling anybody publicly, because he was afraid it would get shot down by his own Congress. Then, as the war advanced, in various conferences with other leaders, particularly Winston Churchill of Great Britain and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, and Tehran and Cairo, Casablanca, he insisted at every conference that the 2 of them agree with him that this security body come into being. It was a difficult, persuasive effort because Stalin and Churchill had their own reservations about the body. Eventually they came along. Now he had to face the fact that they had to design a body which was workable and would correct the mistakes that were made during the League of Nations. In fact, the League of Nations overhung the entire effort in creating the UN body because so many people were afraid the same flaws would emerge that, in a sense, weakened and eventually made the League of Nations fall into disuse. First of all, from the point of view, again, of the Americans, it was absolutely critical that the US Senate agree to actually ratify this treaty. They're the ones who had destroyed all the hopes of America back in the early 1920s when they refused to ratify the League of Nations. So FDR, in a very sophisticated and enlightened way, I might say, set up to make sure that the delegation that the US sent to San Francisco was one that was equally balanced between the 2 great parties in America, Republicans and Democrats. Woodrow Wilson had never done that back in the League days. He'd sent simply a delegation of mainly Democrats. So the Republicans had no particular investment in the outcome of the League. Second of all, he also made sure that there was a woman on the mission that the U.S. sent there, Virginia Gildersleeve, the dean of Barnard College, a recognition of the growing constituency of women ever since the vote for women to vote in this country came into being in the 1920s. Third, he wanted to convene the meeting during wartime, knowing that most countries would be focused on this conference. But if the war had ended, they would have been less interested. They would have been more attuned to fixing up their own war-torn society. So important that this conference happened during wartime. Finally, unlike the League, this was not a peace conference. This was simply set up as a meeting to draft and endorse a new UN charter. If they got into a peace conference, it would have messed up the whole idea of this single-minded approach of Roosevelt's. Finally, the US financed the entire conference. They even flew in delegations from countries that had been devoid of any air force or any transportation because of the war. They flew these delegates in from using US planes from around the world. Now, in constructing the body, along with the British and of course the US State Department, Roosevelt's idea was to mix idealism and realism in the way the body itself was created. Now, by realism, I mean that he understood that you had to deal with the power realities that existed in the world at that time. First of all, his idea was to make sure that the people, the states that came to San Francisco and for the UN were based on the 1648 Westphalian principles of sovereign nations. This was not to be an elected world government. It was to be a government, each government would be represented there by an ambassador, but there was no democratic election to produce that representative. Second of all nations should be accepted, whether they were democracies or dictatorships. It was important if you're going to have security to have all nations represented at the UN. Then his idea of realism extended to the creation of the body called the Security Council. The Security Council was set up to be a small body that would decide all issues of war and peace, and it would have military type powers. Although the UN, as we all know, does not have its own army, nor a taxing power or legislative functions, but it does have this ability to act on war and peace, assuming that the Security Council acts in unison. Now, the most important venture from his point of view was to give the 5 victorious allies of the Second World War, Great Britain, France, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, all single veto powers, very broad veto powers, and permanent membership on the council. Why did he give these 5 countries alone the veto power? They were the ones who had the largest armed forces and the greatest wealth, and they could therefore be assured to enforce UN mandates, where the smaller countries were not in that position to do so. But even more important from the point of view of Roosevelt getting the confirmation and acceptance by the US Senate of this UN treaty, it was to guarantee that the Senate would support the United Nations. If they knew that the US had the veto power, they were unlikely to dissent about the treaty. They would feel the US interests were being protected by the veto. In any case, he did not do what the League had done, which where essentially every country had the veto. A single rogue state, therefore, could block any action by the League, and it therefore, in a sense, weakened the ability of that security body to act in a crisis situation. Now, I will say that when San Francisco rolled around, many of the smaller countries objected to the idea that these 5 countries should have the veto. But the US and the Soviet Union made clear that if they didn't get the veto, they were going to leave the conference, and that would be the end of the UN. And therefore, the smaller countries backed down with that assertion of blatant power on the basis by the likes of the US and the USSR. Now, on the other hand, the General Assembly was to be the idealistic part of the United Nations. There, every state had a single vote, and the every state, whether it was small, big, large, rich, poor, whatever, had its own vote to get to cast a ballot about any General Assembly resolution. Now, the one big difference, though, is that in the Security Council, any resolution passed by the Council is binding on every member state. They have to obey it. In the General Assembly, the resolutions are not binding on member states, but it still retains a moral force. And also, all states are promised there will be no interference in their domestic affairs, an actual very crucial part of the charter setup. In the end, the UN barely survived the conference, and I'm just going to close by listing 4 or 5 occasions in which the conference almost was crippled and went out of existence. First of all, Roosevelt died shortly before the conference, and a new president in the US took over, Harry Truman. Nobody knew who he was or what he believed in, but it turned out he was one of the great internationalist presidents of the United States, and he supported fully the United Nations. Second of all, as I indicated, the smaller states rebelled against the veto. They almost left at one point from the conference. Third, Latin American countries themselves as a body threatened to depart because they felt that one of their countries, Argentina, which was a pro-Nazi country, might not be admitted. Finally, it was. And finally, as I said, the US and the USSR threatened to themselves leave if they didn't get the veto. So the conference was a nip and tuck situation, but it finally survived. And it survived, in my view, because of the critical nature of people facing a third world war, the possibility of one. So on that point, I'll finish there.
So we see that the allies, the big powers, there were 5, there were also 3. Would you go into more detail, each of you, about the role of the big powers and how they had prepared for this conference in advance, already had some agreements, and how they wielded their power? Professor Kennedy.
Yes, I'll give Stephen a break here.
Yeah.
It is true that while there were 5 powers who get the veto and they have a permanent seats, it's more the big 3 who are the wielders of influence and the determinants here. As Mr. Schlesinger said, these big 3, but particularly the Senate of the United States and Uncle Joe Stalin, had to be assured that if they entered this permanent contractual organization of a future, they themselves would retain some forms of veto rights and some forms of control of where things were going. So it not only is there the clause which says that there should be no interference in the internal affairs of nations, but there is a particular clause tucked away in chapter 5, which means that every substantive motion put before the Security Council has to go through only with the concurrence of the 5 big powers. That's the hidden language of the veto. For the United States, as Mr. Schlesinger said, there's a really genuine hope of a rebuilding of the world society for avoiding the errors that were built into the League of Nations system, for preserving a peace in the future, and for doing it through essentially a great power system, though admitting that the General Assembly would be the voice of all of the other powers. For the Soviet Union, well, we don't quite know, even though there's been the opening of quite a large number of the Russian archives, we don't quite know what they thought about it all, but they did have to be convinced that it wouldn't interfere in the internal affairs of their nation, and that they would have, if things were significantly tilting against them in some motion, they would have a veto power. So it is this veto power and the special privileges of those big 5 nations, the ones which were bearing the brunt of a fighting and the brunt of a war, and claimed a particular special role. It was this veto power which caused the medium to smaller size states to be in protest about it. Australia, Brazil, other Latin American countries not liking this idea and agreeing to it really as a compromise. And I think, Mary, this is a message that Mr. Schlesinger and I are trying to get over. The contract of the United Nations Charter was a set of compromises between big powers, necessary, sort of development of their power and freedom to do things if a new aggressor state arose in the next 10 years, and the smaller powers wanting a better forum for debate and deliberation. And behind it all, if you had the new security system, in the future, you could turn to the social and economic and gender dimensions of the vision of these people, but security first, representation of governments, not so much peoples, but governments. Let's start with that as we get to the end of this horrible war.
And Professor Schlesinger, there were, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, there were many other issues and personalities involved in the leadership of these big powers. Would you comment about that and anything else you feel is relevant?
Well, I think one of the extraordinary things is the high intelligence of many of the representatives at San Francisco. This was not a kind of one night stand. This was a serious meeting of very principled characters who really were very concerned about what had happened to the world after two great world wars. And I think that you have to remember that Roosevelt, as I said, was a realist. He not only regarded the 5 countries that had the veto as the key figures in making this security body operational. He even called them at one point the policemen of the world, because he saw that you couldn't simply do what the League did, which is throw everybody into the same assembly and figure it all out, among the different interests and big and small countries. There had to be a group of the most powerful countries acting together in order to make the body operational. And it took a while to convince Winston Churchill, for example, of this notion. He wanted a more decentralized idea of the UN, that it would be on a regional basis. So Europe would have its assembly, and Latin America or North America would have theirs, and so on. Eventually, he did sign on under a certain amount of pressure from Franklin Roosevelt. Stalin was equally concerned, as Professor Kennedy pointed out. He thought he would be outvoted on the Security Council because most of the nations were Western nations, were being assessed for membership in the Security Council. And he realized that the only way he could protect the interests, as he saw them, of the Security Council of the Soviet Union, was to have the veto power. So the veto became absolutely essential to his participation in this body. Otherwise, he didn't have really a great high regard for the UN. He knew that his interests mainly were ones that he himself was concerned about, and the countries that surrounded the Soviet Union. But to the extent that he was going to participate in this universal body, he was going to be protected by the veto. Now, of course, what has happened in the ensuing 76 years is that the power realities have changed in the world. And today, the countries like France and Great Britain are really, it's hard to elevate them to the world power status of the United States, China, and Russia. And other countries that have grown in strength and armed might, whether it be Germany or Japan or Brazil or India, are all, very upset that the veto power remains only in those 5 nations that were tagged for that those roles back in 1945. They point out that here we are in 2021, and everything has changed in terms of the power realities around the world. And therefore, there should be some sort of readjustment in the Security Council today. Unfortunately, every effort at reform over the recent decades to change the realities of those 5 countries in the Security Council have been doomed. They just have gone nowhere. The 5 powers simply don't really want any change. They're perfectly happy with the situation. They may give lip service to reform, but they don't really believe in it. And so that is a craw in the throats of many of the smaller countries and the now larger countries since 1945. And it continues to be an issue that is fought regularly every year in today's United Nations.
So there were various roles of, there were various maneuvers among the geopolitical powers. Could you tell us why San Francisco was chosen as the location for the conference? And was it related to the Latin American countries as well as what was happening on the Pacific, or was it simply a revelation that came to Stettinius in a dream?
Well, actually, the truth is that as indicated in the Yalta Conference, which was held in February of 1945, just a few months before the San Francisco meeting itself in April. The story is that the U.S. Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, came to Roosevelt and said, "I just had a dream that the conference should be held in San Francisco." Whether this is a true story or not, it's one that has become part of the historical record. And it is true that as a result of that, Roosevelt decided, okay, San Francisco, it should be. And of course, Russia, the Soviet Union and Great Britain were willing to go along with that at Yalta, because after all, this was an American idea about the UN, and it was an American creation. So it should happen. The conference should happen in a U.S. city. And in fact, just to prolong this a little, one of the reasons why the UN eventually had its headquarters settled in New York City is another story, which is that the people, the countries of the world were so fearful that the US might return to its isolationism back in the 1920s and 1930s, and therefore kind of did not involve itself very much with the UN. They felt, well, listen, if we put the organization in New York City, it will force Americans to address the realities of that organization and pay attention to it. And therefore, it was a way of countering the possibility of future American isolationism that the UN building ended up in New York City.
That's fascinating. And the role of some of the former, or some of the, shall we say, Commonwealth nations or members of the Soviet Union, some of the issues of the border, what we call border states, such as Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. Could you talk a little bit about that, both of you, because it appeared that there was quite a bit of maneuvering, and agreements were always, it seemed, fudged a bit.
Those trying to understand the exact outcome of the conference and the compromises in the conference in June 1945, I have to bear in mind that at the same time there is the conclusion of the negotiations for the Bretton Woods institutions, for the World Bank and the IMF. And at the same time, or just shortly after that, the big three, that is Stalin himself as the host, Roosevelt, and then Churchill before he's replaced by Attlee, are going to go to Potsdam to try to hammer out the borders of Eastern Europe, including Poland. So there is a great swirl of of levels of events, almost like clouds, which you have to grasp. There's the end of a war in Europe. There's shortly afterwards the news of the atomic bombs. There's the Potsdam Conference, and there is the role of the smaller to medium powers meeting with the big powers as they try to hammer things out for the Charter in San Francisco. Security Council is obviously there's a core in the creation of the Security Council itself, but territorial adjustments are going to be made at a different place in Potsdam by the diplomats and the leaders of the three powers. The World Organization dream is going to be there a long way from the bloodshed of Europe itself, a long way from the failed League of Nations headquarters in Geneva, in the New World, with the United Nations set up, as Stephen says, in New York City, and with the headquarters of the World Bank and the IMF going to be set up in DC itself, close to the Congress. So there's idealism, calculation, realism mixed around in these wonderful, extraordinary few months of creation in April, May, and June, and July of 1945.
And yes, Professor Schlesinger, so it seems that Argentina, Belarus, Ukraine, all of that were in a bit of a trade-off among the nations. And what was the role of the Latin American nations?
Yes, there was a lot of maneuvering that went on before the 8th conference even began. At Yalta, Stalin insisted that he get 3 votes, that the Soviet Union get 1 vote, and that Belarus and the Ukraine should get the other 2 votes. The theory being that this would protect the Soviets' interests in both the General Assembly, better protect them, both in the General Assembly and in the Security Council, counterweight the Western majority of nations. Roosevelt acceded to it reluctantly. In fact, he even thought maybe the US should have another couple of votes too, but that went by the wayside. But he didn't assure the Soviet Union that they would definitely get those 2 countries as 2 votes until the meeting actually began. Eventually, at the same time, Latin America was demanding that all of its countries be admitted, but there was a resistance, particularly by Stalin, to having Argentina, which was the most pro-Nazi of all the countries in Latin America, be admitted to the new UN body. So eventually there had to be a trade-off, and the trade-off was that in exchange for Belarus and Ukraine getting each a vote and admission, the Latin Americans would get Argentina admitted. So that kind of diffused one big crisis at the conference. But the other big crisis was Poland. The Polish government was under the domination of the Communist Party in Poland. The US, the Soviets had all their troops all over Poland as the war ended. And at the same time, there was a bunch of Democratic Poles in London who were insisting that they should be the legitimate government in Warsaw. And so the question was, how do you reconcile this group in London with the communists who dominated the actual government in Poland? And that issue was never quite resolved at San Francisco. And in fact, in the end, there was a kind of compromise in which a number of the exiles in Polish exiles in London were admitted to this puppet government that the communists had set up in Warsaw as a kind of face saving for the West. And in the end, of course, Poland went communist anyway. But that was a way of avoiding another crisis that might have popped up that could have crippled the UN conference. So these are, as Professor Kennedy was pointing out, these were legitimate attempts to compromise the interests of these different parties in a way that would preserve the ultimate goal of creating this unique organization. And they were, very crucial compromises. If they hadn't happened, we might literally not have a UN today.
Well, there were apparently many close calls, as you note in your excellent, incredible book, Act of Creation. And we see the close calls also in the Parliament of Man. What do you think was the leadership responsible for pulling us through those crises? Was it a close alliance between Britain and the United States? Was it the particular diplomatic skills of our various leaders? So, yeah.
By the time that the delegates of the various nations were meeting in San Francisco from April 1945 onwards, much of the creative, forward-looking and successful steps taken to hammer out the charter itself were being done by professional diplomats with some wonderful international lawyers assisting them. And much of it was done by a small group of State Department and foreign office individuals, some of whom later became ambassadors to the UN. The broad leadership was, of course, looking at the attempts to culminate the war in Europe and fighting the war in the Pacific, and making decisions in some cases about further steps in A-bomb development. So it was left to chiefly the diplomats and the legal specialists. They had to show some of their drafts to these very distinguished representatives, as Mr. Schlesinger says, of the medium-sized powers, just to show them what was going on, mainly to hammer that out. They were trying to create the conditions for a flourishing General Assembly on the one hand, while they were hammering out the specific control measures of the Security Council on the other hand. To my view, Mary, they did a remarkable job. At the end of the day in San Francisco, you have 49 nations acceding to and becoming members of the new United Nations. Poland coming along rather later to make it 50. We're close to 200 right now. And the members of the General Assembly were this mixed group of smaller European states, the Latin American states, members of the British Dominion countries, as well as the Big Five themselves. Quite an achievement, though, with the understanding that there was much work to be done in the future. And if new countries emerge recognized in the international system, they also would become in due course members of the General Assembly of the UN.
We have about 1 minute left, unfortunately. And so I'd like to have us summarize what it is that really made the UN conference a success, and what is a lasting value, a contribution to our continued peace, human rights, and the lofty goals of the preamble.
Well, I will say that the testament to the UN is it still exists 76 years later. How many global organizations have even lasted 2 decades, like the League did? It's extraordinary that it's still around and still relevant and still considered legitimate in the eyes of most states. So I think that alone tells you something. I'll say secondarily, the UN Charter has proven its flexibility as a document, in the sense that it is open to all sorts of new crises that were never anticipated in 1945, and has been able to adjust from season to season. In that sense, it reinvents itself on a regular basis. And I think that itself is another strength of the UN today.
The
Professor Kennedy. Yeah.
great tribute I would make to the United Nations Charter and those who devised it is, as Stephen says, its flexibility of language. It allows for possibilities of change in the future. It keeps the very big, great powers in with some security of their veto. It allows a voice for the smaller countries. It brings in new, smaller countries, and is flexible in response to crises which could hardly be foreseen in an exact form in 1945. But some of the delegates and the drafters knew that the world would be changed, and they tried to have a flexible charter. I doff my hat to that.
Brilliant. So we want to pay tribute to you, each of you, for your incredible contributions to our understanding of the United Nations. It's an ongoing life learning process to learn about the United States, the United Nations. Do you agree? And would you suggest any further reading for us? So we have your fairly recent contributions, these excellent tomes. And we are going to form a reading list for other authors, and this would contribute to our mission of educating about the United Nations.
Maybe I would
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so hopefully we'll be back together next year for an update on our latest impressions of the United Nations Charter. And we go to our music interlude. And thank you again, all of you. We are joined by people all over the world. I'm seeing in our chat that we're receiving all these good wishes from Bangladesh, India, Azerbaijan. It's just beyond our wildest dreams, and this is a world contribution. We hope to work with all of you in the future. Goodbye for now. Thank you.
Oh, actually, Marian, thank you all. Just to interject, we are actually going to go into a 90-second video from the song before we go into Danny Clay's video.
Okay.
Following World War II, Europe and Asia were left in ruins. The devastating effects could be felt in society. Borders were redrawn, tensions were high, and nations had just begun the enormous efforts to rebuild. A new system was needed, an international council that would ensure that these terrible tragedies would never occur again. The United Nations Conference on International Organization, commonly known as the San Francisco Conference, was a convention of delegates from 50 allied nations that took place from the 25th of April, 1945 to the 26th of June, 1945 in San Francisco, California, the United States of America. More than 800 delegates attended. The UNCIO was primarily held in the War Memorial Opera House, with the official United Nations Charter signed on June 26, 1945, in the Herbst Theater of the War Memorial Veterans Building. The American delegates stayed in the historic Fairmont Hotel, and Delegate Gildersleeve interacted with members of civil society organizations such as the AAUW. And as the birthplace of the United Nations, San Francisco is honored to be able to celebrate this momentous occasion.
Okay. All right. And so now we're going to go into Music for Hard Times. Great. We hope you enjoyed that, and introducing our next moderator for the second session, Jim Church.
Morning, everybody. My name is Jim Church, and I'm a member of the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter Advisory Board, as well as the Librarian for Economics, Global Studies, and International Government Information at the University of California, Berkeley. For the second of today's sessions, I'm delighted to introduce to you two distinguished guests who will address how the UN Charter works in both theory and practice, how it has been tested under situations of duress, as well as some of the many conundrums, complexities, challenges, and crises the United Nations faces in today's world. The first of these will be Professor Scott Shapiro, the Charles F. South Mabe Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at Yale Law School. His areas of interest include jurisprudence, international law, constitutional law, criminal law, and cybersecurity. He is the author of Legality, The Internationalists with Una Hathaway, and editor of the Oxford Handbook of Jurisprudence and Philosophy of Law with Jules Coleman. He earned his BA and PhD degrees in philosophy from Columbia University and a JD from Yale Law School. Professor Shapiro is also an editor of Legal Theory and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, as well as the founding director of the Yale Cybersecurity Lab, which provides cutting-edge cybersecurity and information technology teaching facilities. His next book, entitled Insecurity, which I will be sure to obtain as a librarian, details the history and technology of internet hacking. Today, Professor Shapiro will present a short video on whether cyber war violates the prohibition on war under the UN Charter. So thank you very much and welcome, Professor Shapiro.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I was at the Charter Day in 2017, and I met everyone at the wonderful San Francisco chapter, not least of which Ms. Mary Steiner, who's a wonderful person, as everyone knows. I talked about this book, which we had published just then, that year, The Internationalists, which is the story of how the prohibition on war came about and was enacted in 1928 in the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and then was reincorporated into the UN Charter under Article 2.4. Now, when I wrote the book, when Ona and I wrote the book, people were, so it's actually a 400-year discussion of how war has evolved and regulated, and it ends in 2014 with ISIS. And the question people kept on asking was, well, what about cyber war? What about cyber war? What about cyber war? And I didn't know, I mean, you know, I only knew what I had read in the papers. And it turns out to be an incredibly interesting question, not only from a technical point of view, but from a legal point of view. So what I tried to do over the last couple of years, try to formulate my thoughts about how we should think about cyber war in this new world. Obviously, cyber war did not exist in 1945 when the UN Charter was ratified, signed and then ratified. And so how should we think about it? I will just note that the newspapers reported that Vladimir Putin had met at the Security Council yesterday to talk about cybersecurity. So this is very timely question about how we're going to deal with the question of so-called cyber war. So I put together this video, which hopefully took a lot of time making it, try to compress a lot of material into something that's only 17 minutes long, but also is hopefully enjoyable. So anyway, thank you.
Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning, you reach for your phone, you open Twitter, and you find out that hackers have taken down Pentagon's military networks. New tweets start to appear in your timeline. Hackers have triggered explosions at oil refineries, all around the country. They're releasing chlorine gas from chemical plants. They've grounded all airplanes by disabling air traffic control. Then at noon, find out that the New York Stock Exchange has been hit and all trading has ceased. Even worse, the trading records and their backups have been altered. By dinner, they have plunged the entire country into darkness by disabling the power grid. At midnight, Iran claims responsibility for these attacks as retaliation for the crippling economic sanctions levied on their country by the United States. Now, the question I would like to consider is, would these attacks be legal? Would Iran have violated the laws of war in compromising US digital networks? Now, there's no question that it would have been illegal for Iran to bomb US power plants, chemical factories, stock exchanges. As we'll soon see, traditional war, which is often called kinetic war, is illegal both according to international law, US domestic law, and the domestic law of most states. Kinetic war was outlawed in 1928, but cyber war obviously did not exist in 1928. So what I would like to know is, did the outlawry of kinetic war outlaw cyber war as well? That's the question I'd like to talk with you today. But before I do so, I want to take you on a 7-minute tour of the right of war over the last 4 centuries. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the survey into 2 parts, from 1600 to 1928, what I will call the Old World Order, and from 1928 to the present, what I will call the New World Order. So let us begin in 1625, way before the advent of cyber attacks, with the Dutch humanist and lawyer Hugo Grotius, the so-called father of international law, who set out a theory of war which would become the orthodoxy around the world for the next 300 years. According to Grotius, war is a legitimate way for states to remedy wrongs done to them. Grotius did not reserve war simply for cases of self-defense alone, to repel invasions or attempted conquests. He thought that states could go to war for any legal violation whatsoever. So to collect for damages done to property, to collect debts, to resolve dynastic disputes, to deal with violations of treaties, to collect stolen property, protect freedom of the seas, and even to punish crimes. Any legal wrong was a casus belli, a legal cause of war. For centuries, kinetic war was the legitimate way that states resolved their disputes. War, in other words, was legal. Legal as a last resort after all negotiations have failed, but legal nonetheless. Going to war was like going to court, but instead of beating the other side in an argument, you tried to beat the other side to death. Now, the legality of kinetic war had many legal implications, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about 2 of them: the right of conquest and the prohibition on economic sanctions. First, the legal right of conquest. If a state had the legal right to wage war in order to correct legal wrongs, then the law also needed to give states rights to keep what it took. Otherwise, the war would not be serving its purpose. So the United States went to war with Mexico in 1846 and conquered 500,000 square miles of Mexican territory in 1847-1848. And it justified that because it was collecting $4 million in debts that Mexico owed the United States, which it in fact did. Going to war and conquering land was kind of standard thing to do in the Old World Order, as shocking as it may seem to us today. The second implication of states having the legal right of war is that economic sanctions by neutral states on belligerents were illegal. That is, if a neutral favored one belligerent over another, giving it favorable trading terms, for example, that would be an act of war because it would be interfering with the belligerents, with the disadvantaged states' right to wage war with the other belligerent. What we take to be completely uncontroversial, refusing to trade with another country because it started a war, was illegal for much of modern history. So therefore, when Great Britain and France were waging war against each other in the late 18th century, the United States had to decide whether to help France in repayment for its help during the Revolutionary War. They wanted to give favorable trading terms to forgive legal debts. The cabinet ultimately decided that to favor France over Great Britain would be an act of war and would be legally perilous, and decided not to. If you have ever seen Hamilton or listened to the soundtrack, this is the issue in Cabinet Battle 2, the question of whether economic sanctions would be an act of war. So just to recap, in the old world order, war was legal, economic sanctions by neutrals, illegal. And this will all change. It changes in 1928. On August 27, 1928, the leaders of the great nations assembled in Paris to outlaw war in a treaty often called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg after the American Secretary of State Frank Kellogg, and Briand, Aristide Briand, the French foreign minister, who organized and coordinated the effort. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact overturned the Grotian theory of the legitimacy of war as a way of resolving disputes. Whereas war had been the main enforcement mechanism that states used in the old world order, the Kellogg-Briand Pact outlawed it. States would no longer be able to resort to force in order to enforce their rights. Always, with the exception of self-defense, states always retain the right to repel imminent or actual attacks. So the Article 1 of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, is actually very, very short, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the main articles, Article 1, the high contracting parties condemn recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounce it as an instrument of national policy in their relations with one another. This outlawry of war is embodied in the United Nations Charter, ratified by the United States in 1945, in Article 2.4, which states that all members shall refrain from the threat or use of force. Now, the outlawry of war in the old world order dramatically changed it. It affected how all the other legal rights were treated. So in the New World Order, with the outlawry of war being operative, all the legal rights have to shift around it. Let me just talk very briefly about the two I talked before, conquest and economic sanctions. So in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria, virtually no state would recognize the conquest because, after all, they had all signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, removing the legal right of war. So as before, in the Old World Order, states had a legal right of conquest. In the New World Order, there was no longer a right of conquest. Similarly, whereas before, in the Old World Order, economic sanctions were illegal, in the New World Order, economic sanctions are legal. Economic sanctions are the main way, in fact, that states have for enforcing their rights against one another. So now I would like to return to the main question of my talk. How do cyber attacks fit into the New World Order and its outlawry of war? To address this question, I'd like to pose another question, which I think is central to resolving it, which is, are cyber attacks more like kinetic war, in which case they would be illegal, or more like economic sanctions, in which case they would be legal. Now, to answer that question, I want to ask, why is kinetic war illegal? Well, you can think of two reasons. One is that kinetic war is normally extremely violent. There's normally great death and destruction. And this is an evil that states were keen to eliminate. And secondly, kinetic war is the active harming of one state to another. One state attacks, bombs, invades another state's active harming. By contrast, economic sanctions are legal because they're nonviolent and they are a form of passive harming. By passive harming, what I mean is what the state, instead of doing something to another state, like in kinetic war, when a state imposes economic sanctions, it is merely refusing to do something with another state. So instead of doing something to another state, the state is simply refusing to cooperate with another state or states. So what we can do is we can take these two reasons and we can create a 2x2 matrix where the rows are violent versus nonviolent attacks and the columns are active versus passive. And we can see that kinetic war is illegal because it's in the top left-hand corner. Kinetic war is both violent and active, whereas economic sanctions are nonviolent and passive. Let's now move on to cyber attacks. How do they fit into the matrix? Well, once we try to fit cyber attacks into this matrix, we see that the reason why it's been so difficult to analyze cyber attacks is that they don't neatly fall into either top left or bottom right, but populate all four cells of the matrix. Let's take the easy cases first. Consider cyber attacks that have the same effects as kinetic war. If Iran were to blow up chemical plants by exploiting vulnerabilities in industrial control systems, these attacks would satisfy the same conditions that make kinetic war illegal. They would be violent and active. They would go in the top left-hand corner. Take another easy case. Suppose the United States decided to erect a giant internet firewall and prevent any packets coming from Iran from entering the country's digital networks. This too would be straightforward, legally speaking, because the firewall would simply block incoming packets. It would be nonviolent. And because it would be a refusal to interact with another country, it would be passive. Hence, the firewall would be akin to economic sanctions and hence legal. So top left hand is red because it's active and violent. Bottom right hand is blue because it is passive and nonviolent. Now, questions about the legality of cyber war are difficult, as I suggested before, because the legal framework for analyzing war was developed during the world wars when kinetic war was on everyone's mind. That is where violence and active harming went hand in hand. But cyber attacks often pry these two conditions apart. Cyber attacks are often nonviolent and some are passive. So how should we think about them? Now, I would suggest that we not think about them in terms of the laws of war. That is, the cyber operations in the top left and the bottom right, they can be analyzed according to the laws of war. However, the ones on the bottom left and the top right, the anomalous cases, the hybrid cases, they should not be analyzed according to the laws of war, which were developed with kinetic war in mind. Does that mean that the law has nothing to say about them? Well, I would suggest that, in fact, there are norms, central norms of international law, which can regulate these hybrid cases. In particular, the norm of non-interference. States are committed not to interfere with the internal affairs of each other's domestic operations. So for example, when the United States fomented a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 to install the Shah of Iran, the United States was violating the norm of non-interference in Iran's domestic affairs. And when Vladimir Putin orchestrated, approved the attacks on the DNC in 2016, the Russian Federation was violating the norms of non-interference against the United States. So the suggestion is that cyber attacks that interfere with essential government functions violate the norm of non-interference and then therefore illegal. And what would be interference with essential government functions? Well, I imagine interference in elections, utilities, the financial system. These would be the types of interference which have traditionally been understood as being illegal under the norm of non-interference. Now, you may say, well, that's all well and good, but how would we enforce this? I mean, after all, there is no Supreme Court of the world, and there is no global national security agency. Well, I would like to suggest that we use the bottom right-hand corner, that is the denial of other states to use one's own digital networks. So here would be the plan. The plan would be to form what I call cyber clubs. Member states would agree to certain cyber norms and would enforce these norms by threatening to expel or reduce access to networks to those members of the club who do not abide by the rules, and those members of the club, those non-members of the club who cannot abide by certain minimal obligations. Who can imagine slowing down access, reducing access, and in cases of repeated or severe violations, complete exclusion from the network. I would like to thank my colleague and co-author, Professor Arna Hathaway, who helped imagine.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. That was a fascinating introduction to this topic. I'm sure there's a great more that you have to say. We have a few minutes, and so looking at the schedule, I see there is an opportunity for us to banter back and forth. And I see our second panelist, Michael Hartman, has also joined us. And so we may have a few minutes to kill here. I wanted to ask you about the conditions of the club that you just mentioned. Do you have any concept or idea about what shape or form this club might take? Would it actually be under the auspices of the United Nations, or would it be something separate, such as the Paris Club, the G7? How would you see that taking shape? And I'm also just interested and curious about what other work legal scholars have been doing this in this area, and what recommendations they are making, and to what extent the UN has addressed it, either in the General Assembly or in the various peacekeeping operations or human rights bodies. Or so those are just some quick thoughts that I had about these challenges. And
yeah, great. Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me, right? Okay, good. So thanks for asking me about the cyber club. So one of the things that's really interesting about international governance is that there are lots of clubs around the world, and sometimes they operate within the United Nations, sometimes and mostly they operate outside the United Nations. One example, this was operating from within the United Nations, something called the Montreal Protocol for the reduction of the ozone, the production of CFCs, which was in the process of destroying the ozone layer. What happened was a bunch of countries formed a club, and what they said was, we will sell CFC producing ingredients to each other, but just on a reduced schedule so we can phase them out. But nobody who's part of the club can get any of these CFC ingredients. And so that gave people reasons to join the club. And it also gave members of the club the ability to discipline members who were caught cheating. And this was one of the great accomplishments of international governance. We never talk about the ozone layer anymore. That's because it's actually on its way to being, what?
It's been solved, I would say, more or close.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, one of the things that we always focus on things that don't get solved, but because we don't talk about, newsflash, ozone layer continues to heal. And the reason, first of all, it's not particularly interesting for most people, but it also goes against the dominant narrative that somehow in a world of sovereign states, there's no way to cooperate. I believe that there are many ways to cooperate. There's the G7, there's the Five Eyes. So Five Eyes is a club consisting of the United States, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, which formed to share signal intelligence and now all forms of intelligence amongst themselves. There's the Basel Banking Group. There are just many global clubs in the world, and the thought was that it's actually almost the perfect structure for dealing with a problem like cybersecurity, precisely because exclusion from the network is such a powerful tool. I would imagine this would not happen within the United Nations, only because one of the big problems. So let me just talk about the United Nations. The United Nations made a big move in the 2000s when it under the working group. I forget the acronym, UWGGA. If somebody can correct me, but what the UN and the General Assembly, I'm sorry, the working group for the first time said that international law applies to cyber activities, and so that was like a big deal to say that international law applies to which is now a dominant activity in the world, that is cyber communications. The problem is that nobody was able to make any progress after that. And that's just because people are just, different states have different conceptions about what proper cyber activity is. And so that gives opportunities for certain types of states to band together and to create their own clubs. And if they're successful, they can now increase the number of people such that only the bad actors are not part of the club, and that would be the goal.
Okay, well, thank you very much for addressing that, and I'd love to hear more. I really would. It would be such a great, honor to hear you more to speak about this. And again, as a librarian, I will certainly pay attention to your scholarship and acquire your book when it comes out. But we must move on to the second of today's distinguished speakers for this panel. I'd like to now introduce to you Mr. Michael E. Hartman, who worked and lived overseas for over 20 years, from 1997 to 2017. He prosecuted war crimes, rape, and corruption, as the first UN International Prosecutor for UNMIK in Kosovo, and as the senior Crown Prosecutor for the Solomon Islands for war crimes, sexual assault, and corruption, where he also mentored young prosecutors for the Australian-led Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands. From 2013 to 2017, Michael was the Director of Rule of Law for the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. His work included the first revision of the Afghan Penal Code since 1976, legislative reform on laws of torture, terrorism, national security, detention, and anti-corruption. Michael's 2 decades abroad mostly involved with UN peacekeeping and peace support missions, including more than 10 years in Afghanistan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and South Sudan. He also taught at the University of Punjab, Lahore, as a senior Fulbright scholar in Pakistan in 1996, and was awarded a resident fellowship at the U.S. Institute of Peace, Washington, D.C., and at the Rockefeller Foundation's Palazzo in Bellagio, Italy. While in the United States, Michael's expertise in the teaching and training of law also took him to several universities, including a position as adjunct faculty at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law from 1994 to 1996. Today, Michael will provide an overview of UN peacekeeping missions with a special focus on Afghanistan and some of the problems that arise when the UN Security Council mandates clash with the host country's laws and constitution. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Michael. It's a real pleasure to see you this morning.
Thank you very much. And folks, from all of that, you've probably concluded, much like Sherlock Holmes, that I am a member of AARP and indeed could get discounts when I go into the movies and other things. That's what happens when you live and have a long career. Anyhow, let's go to, please, if I could have, thank you very much, the slides. Next. So folks, we all know why the charter back 76 years ago was indeed, let's stop right there. Yes, thanks. Was indeed ratified and agreed to by all the parties because of World War II. Next slide. And so, next slide. And so in the building that we can all see across from City Hall in San Francisco was the conference which resulted in the charter on this day 76 years ago. Next slide. I'd like to first address how the charter, which is like the constitution of, if you will, the UN, let's talk about what it does and how the UN is organized. As someone who did not ever work in the regional headquarters, but in the field, I saw the UN from a distance many times or on video. Let's go to next slide. So let's start with what the charter does. The charter and the Constitution requires and authorizes the UN to maintain international peace and security, along with these other protect human rights, deliver humanitarian aid, promote sustainable development, and support, advise, and mediate international law. A common misconception is the ICC is a UN body. It is not. It was created by the Rome Statute, which is a treaty where everyone, almost everyone on the planet, in terms of member states, well, with the exception that the United States has not unfortunately ratified it, but others have. Next. So let's talk about the 6 principal, you can call them organs or structures in the UN. And obviously I don't have time to read all this fine print. Next slide. So we're gonna just pass by it because we've got to get to some other things. The principal organs, that big chart shrunk down, are these. The General Assembly you've heard about. Let's go to that first. So the main thing to remember about the General Assembly is one state, one vote, which means out of the 190 odd current member states, the US, for example, has one vote. You can guess this means that at least as to the use of force and other critical UN tasks, the veto holders, the primary nations, because they are permanent as opposed to not. And by primary, I mean in terms of the power balance within the United Nations. So let's go on past the General Assembly. We're not going to talk about what they do. The Economic and Social Council, however, let's stop here, is the principal body for economic, social, environmental issues, developmental goals. It is the coordinating body for what we called in the field the UN country team. Those are agencies, funds, and program like a UN development program. Let's go on. I think I have another slide for this. No, so let's stop. So just to go back, the Economic and Social Council is the council where all the other parts of the UN, the country teams, the agencies, funds, and programs that are not part of the Secretariat interact with the UN. And those are some like WHO that I think you're familiar with. Next slide. So now for this very quick view, next we have the Security Council. And this, in terms of our topic, which is use of force, is what Professor Shapiro talked about. All of this would be decided, that is the actual enforcement in the Security Council. Next. So the Security Council, and I'm going to slow down here because I think we have a little more time. The Security Council has 15 members. Each of them have one vote, but 10 of those members rotate annually, while the permanent 5 members, US, Russia, China, France, England, all have the right to veto. And that means when you're talking about setting up peacekeeping missions under Chapter 7, and let's go further. Next slide, please. The UN Security Council has powers. What powers? We have to look at the actual charter. Now, the charter in Chapter 5 talks about 15 members, and the non-permanent members rotate. The Chapter 7 itself, well, Chapter 6 is how the Security Council has powers for what they call pacific or peaceful settlement of disputes. These are non-compelled, these are negotiated. And I'm not going to talk about Chapter 6 because I want to last focus on what gives the Security Council the power to use force and use armed forces and to use force against people in a host country if they need to in order to preserve the peace. Chapter 7 says that the Security Council, let's go back. No, this is fine. The Security Council may make recommendations or decide the measures that may be taken in accordance with the next 2 articles. So you have measures not involving the use of armed force, such as air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other communications are interrupted, and also severance of diplomatic and economic relations or economic sanctions. Article 42 is the key for the peacekeeping missions that I was in, and that is, it may take such action using forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. That can include blockade, air, sea, or land force operations by any members. So That's the key, and that's the power of the United Nations Security Council. Now, how is that actually carried out from the standpoint of me as someone in a peacekeeping mission far away from New York where they do the voting? The UN Security Council passes a resolution. The resolutions have their numbers starting from the very beginning, and so all resolutions have a specific unique number. The resolution creates a peacekeeping mission, and by that, it's got to provide its mandate, what it's supposed to do, what its goals are, how it's going to do it. Every year, that mandate is renewed, many times amended. And for example, for me, when I was in Kosovo or Bosnia or Afghanistan, we would wait, because in Afghanistan, it was March that the mandate, the resolution was renewed. We would have a big workup period to send an input to the Afghan desk, the UNAMA desk in New York, where we would suggest changes that we in the field thought were necessary. Sometimes they'd be taken, sometimes not. The final decision is made in New York by the SG and all the people that are working to assist the SG. Next slide. So you see here Ban Ki-moon and SRSG, current SRSG Gutierrez in a picture. The United Nations, and those are the last two SGs. The United Nations has 4 headquarter duty stations. New York is the primary, Geneva, Nairobi, and Vienna are the other 3. Next slide. So what affected me being out in missions was that you had the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. It used to be called DPKO when I was there. And that consists in New York of the Office of Rule of Law, Security Institutions, and the Office of Military Affairs, among others. The missions under the DPO leadership include Kosovo, Lebanon, and South Sudan. The Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, DPPA now, they have as well, they have the Rule of Law and Security Institutions and the Office of Military Affairs. Their missions, and I have unfortunately messed up on the slide, so let me correct it. The missions of the DPPA include UNAMA, which is Afghanistan, UNAMI, which is Iraq, and many others. Let's go to the next slide. So these manage those missions in New York. Next slide. So let's talk about peacekeeping in general. And next slide. And I want to go to some examples. Let's take how a mandate affects what the actual mission does. In Kosovo in 1999, you had a mandate for the UN to come in, and this was a mandate which was probably, which you're not going to see anymore. Because what happened, as you recall, in Kosovo, is that when the Serbian government authorities of the province of Kosovo, after the conflict, went back into Serbia, you then had a province, Kosovo, which had a lot of the government had just left. So it was decided that in order to assist the people of the province of Kosovo, which were primarily Kosovo Albanians, that the UN would be the entire government. All legislative and executive powers, including administering the judiciary and appointing judges and prosecutors, were vested in the Secretary General Special Rep, or the SRSG, the UN leader in UNMIC. And that means, and that's how I got there, because I was appointed as the first international prosecutor, which means I had the same authorities as all the other prosecutors in that country, except I could take any case that we felt that the UN should have in order to be fair to both sides. So I was allowed to do that. And then my colleagues, the judges, the same. Now, let's talk about how, so first of all, that is a great impingement upon the sovereignty of the people in the host country, or the host province in this case. Only twice has this been done with the UN. This very strong mandate, that was UNMIC, and that was UNTATE, which is East Timor. We call it an executive mandate. And let's talk about one of the problems, even though this was changed so that the original mandate was weakened. In order to get Russia's vote for the original mandate, there was a compromise where the original language put in the resolution states, quote, that Kosovo is an integral part of the member state of Serbia, unquote. And because of that, because of how it was stated, Russia was, for many reasons, a great supporter of Serbia diplomatically. And now, even though you have most of Europe and the United States recognizing Kosovo as an independent country, every resolution passed on UNMIC still has that language about being part of Serbia, because because Russia has a veto power and Russia's got to get on board. So let's look at another example. Let's go further. Next slide. Let's talk about UNAMA in Afghanistan. It started with, if you will, a very small footprint in 2002. There was a Bonn conference in 2001 where the donors, the major countries involved, all said, we'll take these areas of responsibility. We will be donors and also have people on the ground working with our Afghan colleagues in these areas. The United States took the military forces. The United Kingdom said, we have to do something about the heroin. So they tried counter narcotics as their main focus. For Italy, it was justice. And for Germany, it was the police, and others had it as well. Look at the original mandate. It states, it urges, and this is the language, they always have the language in italics up front, urges bilateral and multilateral donors, so that includes all of the countries in Afghanistan, to coordinate very closely with the UN. Look how it states as to the relationship of the UN with the NATO ISAF, which are the military forces. It requests the International Security Assistance Force to work in close consultation. So look, unlike some missions in Africa especially, where the armed forces are actually put under the control of the UN, in this case, and that happened in the first Bosnia mission, in this case, you simply state that it is to work in close consultation. So it's a very small footprint. Next. Now, next slide, please. Now let's look at, for example, another decade past and how the mandate has changed. So you'll see, first of all, it talks about how the UN should support the government. In the first mandates, you didn't have as much language that refers to the eventual transition of all functions to the Afghan government. Here, the Afghan National Priority Programs was a strategy that the country worked on issues of security, governance, and justice. Second, it asked that the SRSG lead and coordinate the international civilian effort and to support, among other things, Afghan elections. So that's widening the footprint in that the UN's working with the elections, and also that states that lead and coordinate is stronger than the previous language. Last, for my area of rule of law and others, take a look at this language now. We didn't have that before. This justified the rule of law unit, which included 7 field offices, all with lawyers, Afghan and internationals in 8 regions, as well as headquarters. It states to improve governance and the rule of law, including transitional justice. We're talking war crimes, crimes against humanity. And that, I must say, parenthetically, unfortunately, was not seen in any government actions, but it did result finally in 2017 in incorporating all the crimes of the International Criminal Court and the Rome Statute into the Afghan Penal Code, and that was decreed by the president and is now law. So that's a transitional justice. And notice it says fight against corruption. So through lobbying, we got that put in. That is a new language. And those of you who are unaware of the problems with corruption need to know that when I got there in 2005, Afghanistan was something like 15th or 20th worst of all countries, according to Transparency International, in terms of a corruption index. And by 2010, 5 years later, unfortunately, Afghanistan was seen as the most corrupt. It became an issue that resulted in both Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State and UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown to come to Afghanistan in 2009 and open up special units for anti-corruption work in the Attorney General, financed by the US, with a lot of US mentors helping them out. And as well, you had other issues involving financing to try to fight corruption. So notice it also states that the member states participating in ISAF NATO may take all necessary measures to fulfill its mandate. Now, why is this important? Because I want to give an example of what happens when there's a clash between the Constitution and laws of the host country, in this case, Afghanistan, and what ISAF or NATO did in Afghanistan. And what NATO countries did, including the United States, who did this on their Bagram Air Force Base, as well as the UK in their military base, when they would sometimes capture Taliban or what was defined by the government or they as terrorists that were attacking, if they captured people, they would often put them first into the military base and interrogate them. And the problem with that is, according to the Afghan Criminal Procedure Code, which was authorized under the Constitution, that particular code states that within 72 hours, anyone who is violating terrorist laws in Afghanistan must be turned over to the judicial system for its prosecutors and judges after it's given to their police for 72 hours to do their own interrogations. In one particular famous case, there was a case, let's go to the next slide, please. In one particular case, there was the UK Royal Courts of Justice Mohammed versus Ministry of Defense. In this case, an Afghan citizen who was detained by the United Kingdom's military in their military base for 3 months before being released was suing, using pro bono help in London, the Ministry of Defense of the UK for damages for illegally keeping that person there. So in that 2014 trial, what occurred was that the judge found, and I testified as one of the expert witnesses, the judge found in that case that indeed, in this particular case, the Ministry of Defense could not say that simply because the Security Council resolution said they may do everything necessary, which they use as a defense. So one of the necessary things that we are doing is we're going to detain these folks while we interrogated them further. And the court said, in effect, the Constitution and the laws of the host country, they should have been followed. You can't use all necessary because you have to look at each resolution and its language as part of the UN Charter. And if you look at the rest of the UN Charter, clearly there are limitations based on human rights that charter imposes and should be interpreted by. Also, if you want to say all things necessary, in effect, one of the arguments was, which prevailed, in that case, you can justify torture. You can justify extrajudicial killing. You can justify many things under the rubric necessary. And that's why the court held for Mr. Mohammed Sardar, even though in that particular case, it also found, unfortunately, that the UK's sovereign immunity wouldn't give him any damages. Now, let me give you one more example. How is my time working?
We only have a minute or two left, Michael. I could listen to you forever and more, but
then let me stop right now, Jim, because you or other people may have questions that I can answer or discuss quickly.
I did have one question, and again, we probably only have a minute or two, but I was very interested in hearing about how the broad mandate and the great, deal of freedom, if you will, that the United Nations was given in terms of, handling all of these governmental, civilian, extramilitary affairs, how that was perceived by the civilian population. Was it perceived as a form of neocolonialism or anything like that? And has the Security Council of the UN learned anything or evolved from its position in terms of refining the mandates to make them less broad in, like say, current operations that are taking place around the world?
Sure, briefly. Yes, the UN did a lot of lessons learned where we were brought in and then asked a lot of questions and discussed. The mandate, which is executive, which includes legislative, executive, and even appointing judiciary, you are not going to see that anymore. The model used now is much more the assistance mission. Because of national sovereignty and indeed the tone of imperialism, that is not going to happen. When I was in Kosovo, however, we were seen as, we were welcomed at the beginning, certainly, because we replaced an oppressive Serbian regime, to quote those who are Kosovar Albanians who were so happy to see us and told us that. Thank you, Jim.
That's great. Unless anyone else has any questions, I just have been getting texts that we can actually go a few minutes longer until noon. Michael and Scott, I just want to thank you so much for appearing and giving us two fascinating talks today. It's a rare privilege that we get to hear from both a distinguished academic and a practitioner with decades of experience in the field, in the day-to-day operations of working with the UN, the particular attention given to the details of the mandates and the language and the complexities and obstacles we face in an ever-changing world. But unless you wish to exchange any questions between each other, perhaps we should now move on to the musical interlude, which will be brought to us by Pamela Z. But in any event, thank you both so much. It's been a real pleasure hearing from you. And with that, I think we'll move on to the next part of our session.
Dear pen pal, my computer is broken. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to write, but as you can see, I'm not too good at this. And sometimes I have to backspace over words and type X's through them because I don't have any whiteout. I hope I get my Mac back soon. Until then, you probably won't hear from me too often. Love. Pamela Z at typewriter.com.
We hope you enjoyed this musical interlude, and now we will pass it over to session 3, led by moderator Fyodor. We will spotlight him shortly.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fyodor Ovchinnikov. I'm an outgoing chair of the UN Global Consultations Committee of the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco chapter. And in a moment, I will introduce our panelists. But before I do that, please allow me to give you a little bit more context for this session. So we're going to talk today about the UN 75 Global Conversation 1 year later. So my committee hosted a series of consultations in San Francisco last year, which was part of the global conversation called for by Antonio Guterres, Secretary General. And the whole conversation was an interesting and unprecedented move by the UN to engage a lot of people all over the world. Primarily, these engagements were in the form of survey responses or sometimes dialogues, and then people voted on certain issues. So in San Francisco, we decided to take a little bit different approach, and we got approval from our national office to use a process called World Cafe and then collective narrative methodology as a documentation technique to actually allow people to frame issues in their own language as opposed to vote for issues that are framed for them. And we collected different voices from San Francisco and published reports based on these voices. So we submitted these results to the United Nations, to members of US Congress and other decision makers. And we also used these results of the consultations for our advocacy efforts and programming, including this session. So we looked at different stakeholder groups. So for example, we hosted a consultation with government and civil society, including San Francisco Consular Corps members, representatives of organizations that signed the UN Charter in 1945, et cetera, et cetera. And we also talked with homeless people and frontline workers, with healthcare professionals, with business and tech, et cetera, with youth representatives. And then we brought representatives of all these stakeholder groups together to have a conversation across different stakeholder groups. That was in March, April last year. And then when the 75th session of the General Assembly was being conducted in September last year, we asked our delegates to watch whatever information becomes available from that session. And we hosted another consultation with representatives of those different stakeholder groups to ask people what they think about the UN General Assembly, right? Whether the issues that they care about were addressed and how, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to that, exactly 1 year ago, we collaborated with 5 national United Nations associations and from Venezuela, France, Pakistan, the United States, and Ghana. And we hosted charter dialogues with about 120 participants from 39 countries, where we put voices of San Francisco in global context and looked at how these issues are framed by international participants. So that is the body of insights and actionable recommendations for the UN and other stakeholders that we are looking into right now, including in preparation for this particular session. So we want to discuss certain topics and questions that came up for our participants that were some of the most burning questions. And so we're going to discuss these questions with our distinguished panelists, with Dulcie Lembach, editor and co-founder of PassBlue, a digital publication that covers the United Nations, contributing author to the UN Association USA, A Little Known History of Advocacy in Action. And Barbara Crossett, senior correspondent, senior editor and co-founder of PassBlue, former foreign correspondent for the New York Times, author of State of World Population 2010, From Conflict and Crisis to Renewal, Generations of Change. And with this, I will give our distinguished panelists, I will invite our panelists to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail, and after that, we'll move on to the questions. Please, Dulcie. If you could unmute yourself.
Okay, so many things to do. Thanks very much. I'm really excited to be on this panel, and it's 3:12 here in New York City in Brooklyn, and it's raining. It's actually a sun shower, so it's sort of pleasant, and I really enjoyed that music. And just to clarify that in my bio, I also was an editor at the New York Times for 20 some years. So when I actually met Barbara, it was after I left the Times and after she left the Times, but it worked out pretty well because we were both working at UNA USA in New York and putting together their print magazine, and then we had to put it online. So that's how we started collaborating and focusing on the UN, and eventually turned the UNA USA publication into an independent journalism site called PassBlue.
Wonderful, thank you, Dulcie. And Barbara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, except my video isn't working. Oh, here we go. Maybe here we go, maybe not.
Yeah, we still don't see you, Barbara, but that's okay. You can just go ahead and introduce yourself.
It's okay.
It'll work, yep.
Okay, I just keep pushing start video, nothing happens, never mind. I think my bio kind of covers the big picture. The reason I got very interested in reporting from the UN, and I asked for that assignment, was that I had, during the more than a decade, I had been reporting from abroad, mostly in Asia. And I was seeing the UN from the field first, in a way, although obviously I lived in New York and I worked for the Times in New York, so I knew the UN and I went there frequently. But the difference between for example, the folks who run the missions, the country missions, who were always welcoming and expansive in their explanations, who actually became friends, some of them. And so then when I got to New York and I ran into this kind of bitter US public opinion about the UN and the assumption that the people in the UN were all, living on the Upper East Side and doing very well, thank you. I had seen, I'd seen people really suffering in the field. And so I guess I came with slightly more sympathy to the UN staff, not the top officials necessarily, but I was at the UN for 7 years. And after I retired, I also did 2 State of World Population reports in two consecutive years for the UNFPA, the Population Fund, which gave me a chance also to see how the UN was working in places like Haiti, where I went right after the earthquake, and later in the year, and many other places. I did 2 basically round the world trips for them, tying together a lot of things that I had sort of seen fleetingly as I was traveling from country to country. So that's what I came to the UN with more than anything else. And I still believe that it wouldn't hurt for many young journalists who want to report on international affairs to go see these people at work, and to see what kind of lives they lead and to see what dangers they endure day by day, and the problems they have keeping a family together and all that. That's about it. But otherwise, I did a lot of reporting on Asia, and I did reporting elsewhere too, off and on in Central America, because I could speak enough Spanish to order lunch, I guess, and other places around the world. And I taught journalism in India on a Fulbright fellowship, and I taught journalism in Southeast Asia, so Cambodians, Burmese, Lao, and Vietnamese, again, after I left the Times. I couldn't do any of these things while I was still there. So that's basically my background.
Wonderful.
So I'm an internationalist, which is a bad thing to be under our recent president.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barbara. That's a fascinating story. And I can totally resonate with some potential contradictions between those who work in New York and Geneva for the UN and those in the field. At the San Francisco chapter, we try to bring those 2 worlds together in some of our panels, and it's not always easy, right? So for people from the field and people from the kind of headquarters find common language, but yeah, it is something that we need to do if we want to move on, I think. So for the first question, I wanted to just start with this broader topic of democratization, and that is also connected to transparency and accountability. Because with this global conversation, it inspired a lot of people as far as we see, and our delegates were absolutely thrilled that the UN was interested in actually looking at what ideas they had, et cetera, et cetera. So, and we know that Antonio Guterres is talking a lot about youth. If someone watched his New Year address, it was all about youth, that it's the responsibility of the young generation to step in and do the work, and et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot of conversation about engaging people, coming together and bringing the new generation and following the lead of the new generation. There is a lot of excitement about that in our consultations. But at the same time, there is a little bit of, mistrust. It's like, is it just talk or is it real? And one pretty disappointing development that I personally noticed is that despite the fact that there were several very interesting candidates for the Secretary General position, very unconventional, yet very smart, talented, and who raised a lot of important issues including transparency and accountability. So they were pretty much ignored by the mainstream, like the high levels of the United Nations. And Antonio Guterres was elected, and he was the only candidate who was endorsed by a member state. So there were no alternatives, and I expected him to at least acknowledge the positive trends that are emerging and maybe tell those other candidates that he will listen to their ideas, or that he would encourage them to become, to keep pursuing their aspirations and become, one of them would become a Secretary General later. So at least some kind of acknowledgement when you see the fruits of the democratic conversation. If you look at what our delegates say, is that I quote, "A bottom-up approach is crucial. We need transparency at all levels and exemplary accountability from those at the top. And we believe that the energy and integrity of bottom-up thinking could positively affect the dynamic at the top." So we see this positive energy in the bottom, right? So is it affecting the energy at the top, in your opinion? And whoever wants to answer, both of you, please just step in and you can answer. So what about this transparency and accountability, and what is happening really, and compared to what is being discussed?
Well, I can address some of that because PassBlue, which is the host, has spotlighted your video. Okay. You know, we're independent, and so we cover lots of different angles about the UN. And one of them we started covering this year was the re-election campaign, or the re-election of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, based on what had happened 5 years earlier, when there was a whole big open new process for selecting a Secretary General. Naively, I actually thought there would be a similar type of huge transparent effort to find the right person to run the UN for another 5 years. But in fact, in this year, Antonio Guterres, it was unclear if he was going to run again. He waited until mid-January to announce that he was going to attempt to be the UN leader again for 5 years. And that incumbency sort of put the kibosh on, you know, other countries putting forth candidates. There was a lot of reluctance among many diplomats I spoke to present any other candidate that would challenge Guterres. And as one diplomat said to me, no one wants to hurt his feelings. So that changed the whole dynamic. And then there were several candidates who cropped up, self-nominated candidates, for want of a better term. None of them truly qualified. There was a former president of Ecuador who did throw her hat in the ring toward the end, but she bumped up against, you know, a requirement. It's not a legal requirement that her country should endorse her, or any other country, which didn't happen. So the UN President General of the Assembly Office, who was sort of leading this process, and the Security Council presidency, which rotates each month, were also supposed to be equal partners in this process. But there was pretty much silence from both ends on any of these sort of self-nominated candidates. And Guterres himself was basically recusing himself because he was a candidate. And his spokesman would repeatedly say in media briefings, we cannot comment on these other candidates because Guterres is a candidate. So that was the position. And basically these candidates, I think it amounted to about 7 of them, you know, the UN President of the General Assembly would not even release their names. So I would have to ask around. And some of them were protest candidates, basically saying that they were unhappy with lots of aspects of the UN, including transparency and what they called corruption. So their candidacies never really got off the ground. So it was sort of a sputtering process that died out last 2 weeks ago when Guterres was formally nominated or reappointed by the General Assembly by acclamation. So the bottom line on how youth might perceive this is a good question, because one of the candidates, the Ecuadorian former president, was nominated by a youth campaign based in London. And they went and searched for an appropriate candidate, or what they thought was an appropriate candidate, a woman. And she was a head of state. So when they submitted her name, they actually thought they would get a acknowledgement, but they never did. So I think they were grossly disappointed in the reaction of the UN formally and in the process itself. So, I mean, for young people watching this process, I can understand they would be disappointed, if not a little baffled by the reaction of the President of the General Assembly and the respective presidents of the Security Council.
I can just add, Theodore, if I can just add to that, I think Dulcie has laid the groundwork for two conclusions, more than laid the groundwork. We all know what happened now. And people should remember this is what happened. The 2016 example that she talked about, which was constructed carefully over more than a year, I think. She can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was so organized and it was so well run that, you know, we had candidates who were presidents of several countries on stage, or other people who had run major UN projects on stage in front of public audiences in New York to be interviewed by journalists. We were able to do other things. Now, the mistake was that was never put into any kind of a formula that could be adopted by the General Assembly for future elections. Maybe they say they can't do it. But so it falls back on one General Assembly president who he felt was abiding by the rules. But it was a mistake not to. It was a lesson in what you can do in the General Assembly on this issue, but it was a mistake not to then formalize it in some way. It probably would have come out the same, because I think an awful lot of people were assuming, as Dulcie suggested, that this was a second term for a Secretary General who hadn't offended anyone seriously of the Permanent Five on the Security Council, who was he had worked for 10 years running the refugee agency. He had been a prime minister of a country in Europe. And so, he might have won in the end anyway. But the point was that there was no system anymore. And there's no question that next time there's going to have to be some change, and it'll be the Security Council, but also even more so the President of the General Assembly. That's who got the process going in 2016 with a lot of help, including from some great people from UNA UK.
Yeah, so do you see this as some kind of an exception, and that the process will become transparent again in the future, or you see this as a kind of trend to respond, for example, to a global pandemic or something like that, so that we don't want or anything? Because at least, and obviously, it's pretty logical that Antonio Guterres is reelected, but in my understanding, it is mostly about acknowledgement of some social movements and some interest that the global conversation sparked last year, and kind of encouraging interest in the UN. Even if the candidates are not qualified, it's not that big deal. I mean, you don't have to make them Secretary General, but you can at least create some space for them to feel included and heard, and actually invite other people all around the world through their campaigns to get interested in the United Nations, in global issues, et cetera, et cetera. So do you see that this would be a logical development of this initiative of global conversation, that we will see more transparency, we will see more inclusion, or this signal is actually an indication of a trend that is about making, like, for example, there is some kind of fear to open it up, and there is kind of a trend to make decisions behind closed doors even more than before. So how do you see this potentially develop in the future?
Elsie?
Yeah, sure. So there actually is a General Assembly resolution sort of setting out guidelines. It's of course very vaguely worded, and there's lots of different interpretations about what this means or that means, especially the quote national endorsement requirement. But you know, they did have a long debate in the General Assembly in April, where the members, basically, this is on the working methods of the revitalization of the UN, but they were focusing on 5 years from now for the process. They basically had acquiesced to the fact that they wouldn't have any influence or change in the process this year. And let me just say that the group that selected Rosalia Arteaga of Ecuador is called the Forward Movement, and it's run by these two young people in London. And you know, when we reported on their effort to submit this candidate, this woman, we were really impressed, and they were like so gung ho, and you know, they really thought they could make a difference. And when they submitted this candidate's name to the President of the General Assembly and the President of the Security Council, they didn't even get a response. So I think they were seriously disappointed, and they, you know, I think it was a lost opportunity for the UN to show its stuff, to address what young people want in a new UN, a revitalized UN. And also the idea that the process will change, will be transparent again when there's a, you know, when Guterres's term is up. UNA UK has already submitted papers on basically saying the process begins now. So this 4.5, 5 year process will begin now, and there will be a huge swell of support for a female candidate. Nevertheless, 5 years is a long time, and there's no saying that a Secretary General can't get a third term, but it's highly unlikely. But also at the end of the day, we ran another article basically saying that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council make the ultimate decision, and that situation will not change.
Yeah, and this is a great segue to our next question. It is about the UN reform, because Antonio Guterres actually hinted that there might be some kind of UN reform, and people got really excited. And some of our candidates were, both in San Francisco and international candidates, were saying something like, oh, Security Council was formed after the World War II, so it does not represent the modern world, so it needs to change. The structure of the Security Council needs to change. Some people are talking about the Parliamentary Assembly as a new institution to include members of parliaments of different countries. And this actually gets acknowledgement from the General Assembly president, for example, at least last year. It did get acknowledgement. And then also there were people, including our distinguished indigenous delegate, who actually said that there needs to be acknowledgement of indigenous sovereignty and the Convention of the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, because the declaration was adopted many years ago, but still there's no convention. Right now, indigenous populations are being internally colonized. Like, for example, we say that countries don't colonize indigenous populations, but if we look at what's happening in the Amazon and Brazil, basically the government says we're sovereign states, so we can do whatever we want internally, but still it's the kind of former colonists are oppressing indigenous peoples of Brazil. So the process of colonization continues, but within this global structure. And some of our delegates expressed some outrage about that, and they said that the UN needs to acknowledge indigenous sovereignty. So some of the major actually suggestions about the whole architecture were being mentioned by delegates. And you are now saying that the current structure will never change, right? So what do you think that's we will always have the UN in the current form, at least for the next few decades, or you see a possibility for some change?
Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, look, the UN is not a country. That's a silly thing to say. But you've got 193 countries. Madeleine Albright used to say, I think it was about 170, then it was like trying to run a board in some sort of institution with 70 members of the board. Essentially, it's the same reason that you don't get much movement on the Security Council, because several of the regions of the world couldn't possibly agree with one another on who would get a permanent seat among those super developing countries. Brazil would consider itself, for Latin America, Nigeria, South Africa, India certainly feels it's sort of is owed as this seat, and other places in Asia say no, we don't want India representing Asia. So you start out with the structure of 193 sovereign nations, all of whom have some desire to be more important within the UN system, and I think to open it up to a parliamentary system would doom the UN, frankly, because it would be just constant gridlock. There are many good initiatives coming from developing countries. It's not just colonization in the sense of the indigenous. There's a big movement going on now, the decolonization of public health, which has been discussed not just because of COVID, but for other reasons also, that the rich countries have a lockhold on medications, on pharmaceuticals, and so on. So there are a lot of big issues out there. And for those of you who were tuning in earlier, to go back and look at how the UN was organized in San Francisco in 1945, you just shake your head and wonder. Mind you, that was, four dozen countries or whatever. But the idea of coming together and actually discussing what needs to be done, when and where, and compromise, which is very difficult right now. I just don't see anytime soon that there'd be any significant reform of the UN, but I could be wrong, and I've been there too long.
There was something that the German ambassador, who is very forthright and very assertive, he did tell the media this week that, and he's involved in Security Council reform because Germany, of course, would like to be on the council permanently. But he did indicate, and I don't know the technicalities, but he said that they had come close to creating a single text on this issue. And, this issue has been debated for, decades from day one. So he said this was a big leap, that there was a single text for negotiation. And, the relevant countries were all on board, all those who want a seat on the council, including Africans. And then he told the media that there was pushback and by one of the P5 members. And so this text has lost its luster. So, there's sort of pushing toward reform, and then there's pushback.
Yeah, thank you. And it's yeah, thank you, Dulcie and Barbara. And this reminds me of a quote from some of our delegates in San Francisco after they watched some and reviewed some of the materials from the 75th session of the General Assembly last year. So I quote, "One of the glaring things that stood out the most was how the sessions of the United Nations General Assembly have become a platform for airing grievances and grandstanding with no real collaborative effort to create solutions. So which could be an overstatement. And of course, we see a lot of things that are being done and a lot of negotiations that are successful. But to see how people in San Francisco from different walks of life actually perceive what's going on there when they see it is very interesting. And I think that the UN can think of that as a kind of a message to try to come up with certain solutions. And of course, obviously, yeah, there is this I think the core of the matter is what Dulcie, you described, is that it's not, or sorry, Barbara, what you described is the UN is not a country, right? So it's a political compromise. But yet we see, for example, that Millennial Development Goals were still very much one way from developed countries to developing countries, telling what to do. And Sustainable Development Goals is a little bit more collaborative effort where rich countries took responsibility for certain actions within the those countries, and also the developing countries were heard as the framework was being set. So in general, do you see that as a positive trend?
The SDGs, Dulcie will let me intervene here for just quickly, I hope. But the SDGs are in big trouble. And so by turning over, Amina Mohammed said from the start, what you were described, she's the Deputy Secretary General, and she was in charge of these, developing the Sustainable Development Goals. Agenda 2030, I mean, we're coming up, toward that way. It was give the countries, basically, and this is simplification, but the right to decide what the goals would be or which ones they were willing to work on. Now, there are good international scholars now. Barbara Adam, a lot of people know, and Sakiko Fukuda at the New School, who have done a lot of research on this. And they find that they're just, the governments, including some from the West, the governments aren't doing their thing. They're not making the goals advance. And so they are, as the experts will tell you, in real trouble. And part of it was the structure over which they were built. And that's just my opinion.
Thank you, Barbara. And just because we have about 5 more minutes. Since you mentioned governments, part of, actually like a huge part of the frustration that some of the delegates expressed was about the United States. And at that time, it was Trump administration. So, and Trump administration was was prioritizing America. So a lot of rhetoric was that the UN actually should follow American leadership and instead of America collaborating with other countries with using UN as a platform. And basically, there was a lot of criticism of American leadership at many levels, but also there are issues that go from administration to administration in the US, from Republicans to Democrats, etc., such as, for example, the ratification of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And it's been tabled for, I guess, a couple of decades at least. And as far as I know, President Obama, during one of his terms, said that it's a shame that the United States hasn't ratified the convention. And yet we now have another Democratic president, and we had, this convention not being ratified under a different kind of Democratic and Republican Congress and Democratic and Republican administrations. So what holds the US back in signing a convention that the US helped draft? And generally everybody publicly agrees that it's a great convention, we need to ratify it, yet nothing happens. What do you think are the mechanisms behind that?
I briefly can talk about that. I think the United States is the only country in the world that hasn't ratified it. I think even Somalia has made that step. But from what I recall, it's it's a political issue, and that there are some states or some governments in the United States that don't want to be told by the UN what to do with their children. And they want to reserve the right, for example, if they want to spank their children. Whatever it says in the convention, they object to portions of it, if not the whole idea of, being told by a treaty or convention what to do within their home. But Barbara may know more technical matters of it behind
Well,
it.
no, it falls into the general right-wing invention of conspiracies. For a long time, the idea was that children would have the right to divorce their parents. And, you know, there were some people out there saying that. But things like that, that apart from you weren't allowed to spank a child. There were a whole lot of completely false but inflammatory claims made about what this would be if the US adopted it. And I do agree, it was politics, but unfortunately came along or has stayed along just at the time that we have all this other insane politics conspiracy. So I do think a lot of it, if it were better explained, people might know what it is, but it may be too late right now.
Theodore, I'm getting some text messages saying we can keep going to
Wonderful.
1 o'clock your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dulcie. That's wonderful.
Okay.
Then I think we could make a segue to awareness, because one issue that you raised is awareness. If people knew better what it is, they would have different opinion. And we have a kind of a crisis of awareness that was highlighted by some of our delegates. And so sometimes people don't know what the UN is or what the Sustainable Development Goals are. And these are people who are highly educated and hold some positions of institutional power in business, for example, right? And our board member recently shared this funny story about her trying to explain something about the United Nations to a person at a social event, and the person said that, oh, WHO did more to address the pandemic than the United Nations. Which kind of shows you the confusion that people have many times about the UN. So what can UN do? What is UN doing, and what can it do more to increase that awareness?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I must say I don't have a full grasp of the UN. Sometimes I discover an entity I've never heard of before, and I've been following the UN for like 10 years at least. So for the general public, it's a challenge. And, the UN has a lot of public information campaigns. They have a big Department of Global Communications, and they have a huge task ahead of them. And but I think even in the United States, they do little to sort of get to know the public and do public outreach with Americans right here in New York City. And I keep wondering when the Secretary General is going to travel across the United States now that he has a second term and he doesn't have to deal with the previous administration's sort of hostility toward the UN. But it's a tough organization to get to know, and it's heavy on bureaucracy, and so that's where we try to fill the gap to some extent. PASCLU, we try to focus on sort of thematic issues, human rights, peacekeeping, the US-UN relationship, the sort of the most important work of the UN, and we try to explain what this agency does and why, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's where journalism can step in, but it takes a lot of time and effort and money. And our audience is mostly based in New York and Washington. And I think and most of the demographics, most of the readers are 18 to 34. So they want to know about the UN, and they're interested in foreign affairs and going into careers and academia and journalism. But to actually get to know the UN in its entirety, that's very difficult.
Okay, if I can just add, the other thing is that reporting from the UN has crashed. From the major organizations, news organizations, almost all have closed their bureaus or are not using them very much at the United Nations. But I could see back into the 90s that the newspapers were, particularly, I worked for the Times, but media in general were pulling away from interest in the UN. They thought it was going nowhere. Then there was the spectacle of the Clinton administration hounding Boutros Ghali out of office. The feeling was it wasn't just an American, it was some of the Middle Eastern allies of the US who didn't want this person to have a second term and things like that. So there was negativity. Then came the Iraq War. And I mean, the Congress, Republicans and others went after Kofi Annan in a cruel and bitter way because he had made a comment in the Oxford Union that this was an illegal war. This is the 2003 war, not the 1991. And so, so the combination of losing interest in the UN, taking away your correspondence from the UN, removing any space in the publications or online about the UN, and then, you know, and then a series of events that were played big in the American Congress and in general in politics that sort of tarred the UN with a lot of things. And just one small thing that I always say, it's also the personality and the presence of the SG. You know, Boutros Ghali, people kept trying to take to the theater or the concert, and he would always go out at intermission and no one would ever see him again. And I once asked him about, you know, do you get to know the New York crowd? You know, here you've got finance, you've got arts, you've got all kinds of things. And he said, I have 175 other countries. Why should I worry about this one? So, you know, okay. But there is that. Kofi Annan was a public celebrity in New York. And I think if he hadn't run aground on many of these other things, and he survived it made him ill, actually. The attacks he took and the calls for his resignation in Congress. So so there is a bad thing in the air. And Ban Ki-moon was he was withdrawn, and Guterres is unseen most of the time and is certainly not a part of New York life. New York life is not everything, but it has a lot of interesting, you know, centers of power and also visibility.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I also think in the pandemic, it hurt the visibility of the UN exponentially. I mean, the UN headquarters stayed open in the lockdown and kept doing business virtually online. There were some technical challenges at first, but the Security Council meeting met, you know, they met online. And for a while, the face of the UN was actually the Secretary General's spokesperson, Stéphane Dujarric, who held media briefings online to the public. So he informally became the face of the UN, in my opinion, because he was the only one going on camera in sort of such a daily visible way. But you know, the UN, even in New York City, there's just seems very little interest, and you know, that's the public's own perception, but the UN might be able to do more about that, especially now that the lockdown is over, and a lot of the diplomats at the UN want to come back into the building and do their diplomacy. And they've been hankering for this for almost more than a year, and it's slowly reopening. But
tourist, yeah.
Go ahead. And then, you know, no tour guides of the UN right now, and I was always stunned by the legions of people waiting in line to come in to the UN for a tour, and nevertheless, they all seemed that they weren't Americans. So I think, you know, the Pakistani ambassador told me that the UN is valuable for poor countries and middle income countries. Rich countries, they're not that dependent on what the UN does or doesn't do. It's the countries that need the UN that still the people there still seem to care about it.
It's interesting to hear, especially given my background as someone who grew up in Russia and was born in the Soviet Union, because we have a long tradition of honoring the UN, and almost everybody knows what the UN is. And during the Soviet Union times, during the Cold War, everybody looked at the UN as hope for a peaceful future. And I wonder if in the United States it was the same, and it just changed after the Cold War, or it never was the same. And also, in addition to that, have you seen some kind of evolution of the role of the United Nations associations in building public awareness?
Go ahead, Barbara. She's
No,
got the longevity.
I'm sorry?
She's got a longer view of this.
So, okay, ask it again, and I'm still trying to get my video to work. Go ahead.
He was asking about UNA, USA associations, their value in promoting the UN.
Yeah, the evolution of the role of UNAs.
Well, I think they, what can I say politely here? I emphasize, one organization that could have reached a lot of Americans and didn't. I mean, UNA, I'm not talking about chapters, wonderful people, and I was invited to come and speak to a number of them over the years, but that was it. The communications is still not terrific at the UN. It's the hardest thing is to get in touch with anybody. Now, that's one of the things, I learned out, so the head of the UNHCR during the Vietnamese boat people thing, you could go and have lunch with him. You could go to his house for dinner. He was very talkative. He was a terrific man and still is, and he's still a friend. But that's not happening in New York as far as I can tell, although the personal relationships are important. The other thing is that I think people communicate differently. There is no such thing as a UN press corps in the same way as there's a White House press corps or a State Department or a British cabinet or whatever. It's a mixture of people, some of whom are not terribly interested in the UN, and others, are getting some attention at home. But in this country, there's a big gap of trying to reach the people to people stuff. And I have had people at these places I've spoken say, how can we find out more? And again, there aren't. You can't just call up the UN and ask for a speaker. It doesn't work. They're trying that. I think Dulcie would know more than I. And of course, again, the pandemic has put that off. But an awful lot of American school kids are dragged through the UN on these tours. And some of those young people who do the tours are very good. And some of those young people turn out to be diplomats and others from various countries. So it's possible, but nobody's doing it.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, I went over to Newark, New Jersey, which is only really about 20 miles from Midtown Manhattan. But I went there because they have a Portuguese-speaking community, and Secretary General Guterres is from Portugal. And this community in Newark has been there for eons, and they're from Portugal, they're from other Portuguese-speaking countries, primarily Brazil. And I just casually went around asking people in shops and restaurants, do they know the UN? What do they think of the UN? Does it have any meaning for them? And who is the Secretary General of the UN? And, it was very sad. Nobody really had any knowledge of the UN, including who the Secretary General was. In fact, one person said it was Nikki Haley. So, I was just trying to raise the, look at this possibility of even a Portuguese-speaking community having some sort of pride in having the leader of the UN be one of them. And so there was no connection whatsoever. And again, I just thought, this is sort of a problem, or this is sort of
a shame that so little knowledge of the UN is disseminated or understood.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dulcie. And Barbara, it's time for closing remarks. And I would like to invite you to speak from your experiences and your aspirations and the purpose of the work that you're doing. What do you want to leave our audience with? What kind of aspirations or advice or call for action you might want to share?
It says, I have a sign here saying, the host is asking you to start your video. Okay, there's my name, but I think that's all about that. Anyway, so, it's an impossible question. I mean, Dulcie works very, very hard, and we try to touch base all over the world so that we can, through some young reporters that Dulcie has found and taken on, not as reporters, but as contributors now and then. We need a bigger staff to follow all the news. But to reach the U.S. public, I think is key, and that's where because then through social media and so on, which the UN has never been very good at communications. The first person to establish a website for the UN in the 90s or 80s, late 80s, told me that he was denied money from the budget committee in the General Assembly, and he had to, he made a joke about having cake sales, but he had to go and take bits and pieces out of his regular budget just to start a website. And then he put in charge a terrific woman from Germany, and pretty soon she was moved out and someone else was put in her place, a UN person. So, it's the UN, I guess, has to do a little bit more outreach, and I wouldn't know how to tell them to do it, but I do think, as I said before, the UN associations are doing wonderful stuff. Like today, today is a terrific example. Today you could use this, and I hope people do, in classrooms at high school level, maybe private schools lower than that, but just so people know what the organization is, it would be terrific. I mean, that's talking a lot and saying nothing, but maybe that's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, we started this news quiz feature on PassBlue a few weeks ago, and so it comes out every 2 weeks. We're not ready to do it weekly because actually it's a lot of work. But it's meant to test readers on stories that we published within that 2-week frame. And then we decided, well, let's branch out a bit and ask basic questions about the UN, because we think that's necessary and that will draw more readers in. So we're going to look at the idea of sort of expanding the quiz to include questions like, what is the WHO and how does it fit into the UN? And, basic type of questions like that. So, we try to be sort of, a public watchdog, and part of that is sort of educating the public on what the UN does. That's part of civic journalism. But I've forgotten your initial question.
Any calls for action, and you can invite people to follow you, for example, or you could invite them to use your materials or to contribute with their opinion.
Well, exactly. I have an intern, and the person who is writing the quiz, I said, you guys, look at how we can market this quiz to educational institutions, because I'm sure they could use this information. And, we can really make a go of it. And so that's sort of the long-term goal, is to build interest in these quizzes. And, we were using the New York Times weekly quiz as somewhat of a model. And, it's very simple questions. You try to keep it simple, and then you try to build up to sort of harder questions. But that's one way where you can disseminate information and news about the UN. I did listen to Linda Thomas Greenfield is the U.S. Ambassador to the UN under the Biden administration. She had she testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee about 2 weeks ago. And I must say it was really shocking to hear some of the questions that they asked her. And, you know, they're very political questions, of course, very sort of leading questions to get her to say, you know, negative things about the UN. And she held her own, but, you know, I thought, well, this is the House of Representatives, and it seems like they don't know too much, or if they do, they're just ignoring what they know and going ahead full tilt into some sort of political agenda. And this is the big problem, I think, in the United States is there's you know, a determination by some politicians and the right wing, as Barbara says, to discredit the UN. And so at the end of the day, nobody knows what it does or why it's valuable. So that's a problem.
You know, the woman, Dulcie mentioned the quiz. The woman who does the quiz, it's still Laura, right?
Yeah.
She did, we did a big thing about what's wrong with UN communications. Oh my, 4 years ago, I can't remember. And she sort of bird dogged all the social media. The UN is getting creamed on social media. It just doesn't exist. And she found out if you put UN in as a search word, oh, I can't remember, but the majority of responses were all negative and some were brutal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you both. There are some questions in the chat about how people can contact you. Maybe you have contact details on your website, or maybe there's could be people can approach you on LinkedIn or something. Do you have any insight for people who want to contact you, how they can do that?
Well, we have an info@passblue.com. That's an email. And then we have our Twitter account. You can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. So we're all social media'd out. The best way would be to get in touch with us by email, and I'll try to respond.
Or write a comment, you know, read Pass Blue #1.
Exactly. Subscribe to Pass Blue. Subscribe. It's free. You get on an RSS feed where the articles are sent to you by email in your inbox about 3 to 4 days a week, including the weekly summary we produce every Friday. It goes out on the Saturday 4 a.m. email feed. So subscribe to Pass Blue, get to know us, get to know what we cover. And then, you know, we'd like to hear from you. There's a comment section under each article, you know, as long as the comment is civil, we'll approve it. And that's how we can also hear back from you, UNA people. What are we missing? Because of course there's so many topics that we know we're missing, but we do our best.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think it's so important to have honest conversations and also address people's sometimes misconceptions or sometimes valid criticism of the United Nations, and go beyond the glossy picture and try to really have an honest conversation, which, in my opinion, strengthens the UN and supports the mission of the UNA as well, which is to support the United Nations, right? So because the United Nations needs to stay healthy and relevant to the best extent possible. And your work is a great example of civic journalism that helps do just that. So thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you on this panel.
Thank you very much. It was very nice, and good luck in San Francisco. I would like to be out there now.
Yeah, we hope to host you in person after everything, all the craziness is gone. So
yeah, and maybe you'll come to New York. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, okay, Mary, do you want to hop in and say a few closing words?
Yes, all ready to go.
1 second. All right. Whenever you're ready, Mary.
Well, we want to especially thank our outstanding speakers. Each one has contributed incredibly to our knowledge today, and we count them as our precious allies and friends, and we hope to work with them more closely. We never know what's going to happen as a result of these programs, and we've had many wonderful surprises come as a result. However, we do have a plan, and we do plan more programs for this year, 2021. UN Day, October 24th, Human Rights Day, December 10th. There's much to explore, and we are very excited that so many of you have said you're going to join us. We also want to say a special thanks to the crew working behind the scenes. I want to especially recognize Jim Church, who did double duty. He's not only an advisory board member, he's also on the communications committee, and we can thank him for all of our mailings and our website. He's a real genius. And we'd like to recognize Janisha Jones, the lovely voice, in introducing us to each segment. We've gained so much. We're looking at all of the gaps in knowledge and communication about the UN, and we'll be trying to fill those gaps, especially as we work with partners and build our platform locally and nationally. So again, we hope to see you again soon. Please join us. Special thanks again to Dan Becker. He is the one, the wizard behind all of this. He made this go so smoothly, and it definitely contributed to the quality of this program and interspersed with this gorgeous music. We hope that we have stimulated all of your pleasant senses, and we hope to do it again. Thank you again, Dan. Thank you all. Bye for now. Are we going to have the music?
Yes. Sorry, let's introduce our final musical interlude.
Yeah, I'm going to mute.
Thank you all again for joining us. That concludes today's webinar. Take care, everyone.